The first time I heard my own voice in the Appalachian Forest, I thought someone was mocking me. The second time, I thought I was losing my mind. The third time, I understood why the handwritten warning had said never to answer it. By then, it was already too late. The forest was quiet when I heard myself call my name. Not quiet in the normal way. There was no wind moving through the trees. No insects. No distant owl. No branch snapping under the weight of some animal moving through the undergrowth. Nothing. Just the sound of my own voice coming from somewhere behind me. Evan. I froze. My name sounded exactly the way it always did. Same pitch. Same tiredness in the voice. Same slight roughness at the end. It even had the little upward inflection I used when I was asking a question. Evan? I remember staring at the trail ahead of me and thinking that there were only two possibilities. Someone had recorded my voice. Or someone was standing behind me. I didn't turn around. That was the first good decision I made that night. The second voice came 5 seconds later. Evan, wait. I still didn't turn. Then it said something that made the back of my neck go cold. Something nobody else could have known. Your left boot is untied. I looked down. It was. And I had never told anyone. My name is Evan Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked outdoors. Not as a park ranger. Not as a law enforcement officer. Not as one of those wilderness survival personalities who spends a week in the woods for an internet audience. I worked as an environmental field technician. Mostly boring things. Water samples. Soil contamination surveys. Wildlife corridors. Trail assessments. Occasionally, I assisted researchers collecting data in remote areas where vehicles couldn't reach. I liked the work because it gave me an excuse to spend long periods alone without having to explain why. I've always preferred forests to cities. There is something honest about a forest. Trees don't pretend to be anything. Rivers don't care whether you're having a good day. Animals don't ask you to explain yourself. And if you get lost, the forest doesn't hate you. It simply doesn't care. That was what I believed before the Blackridge survey. Blackridge wasn't officially a dangerous area. That distinction is important. It wasn't marked as restricted. There weren't warning signs at the trailhead. There weren't fences. There wasn't anything dramatic waiting on a government map. It was simply a remote section of Appalachian woodland in the eastern United States, far enough from the nearest paved road that most people never bothered going there. The assignment sounded routine. A small research group had been studying an abandoned logging corridor that crossed the mountains. The project had been interrupted after one of the survey teams reported inconsistencies in their recordings. Animals disappearing from thermal footage. Trail cameras showing empty paths immediately before and after movement was detected. Audio equipment recording voices where nobody was present. The original researchers assumed equipment failure. Then they found something else. An old shelter. It wasn't on the modern maps. It wasn't even on the historical logging maps we'd been given. It was just a small wooden structure tucked into a valley beneath a ridge. The shelter had apparently been used by forestry workers decades earlier. Someone had gone through it recently. That was what concerned my supervisor. There were fresh boot prints in the mud outside. Inside, there was a rusted stove, a collapsed bunk, several empty glass jars, and a wooden table. On the table was a piece of paper. 3 rules had been written on it in faded black ink. The first rule said, "Never follow lights that appear between the trees." The second said, "If you hear footsteps behind you, stop walking until they stop." The third said, "Never answer your own voice after dark." I remember laughing when I first read it. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes people laugh when something makes them uncomfortable. My coworker Daniel was with me that afternoon. He picked up the paper and said, "That's either the dumbest warning I've ever seen or the beginning of a horror movie." I told him it was probably an old joke. He nodded. But he didn't throw it away. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. That was August 17th. We were supposed to spend 4 days in the area. We stayed 5. then 6. Then we stopped counting. The first night was normal. Cold rain started around 9. We cooked under a tarp. The trees moved constantly in the wind. Water ran down the slopes in thin streams. The whole mountain smelled like wet leaves and pine bark. Daniel went to sleep around midnight. I stayed awake longer, listening to the rain. At approximately 2:14 in the morning, I heard someone walking around the campsite. Slow footsteps. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. I opened my eyes. Daniel was asleep across from me. The footsteps stopped. I listened. Nothing. Then 3 steps came closer. Crunch. 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 I reached for my flashlight. The moment my fingers touched it, the footsteps stopped again. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. A minute. Nothing. I finally convinced myself it had been an animal. Then something whispered from outside the tarp. Evan? I sat upright. Daniel woke immediately. What? I looked at him. You heard that? He frowned. Heard what? Before I could answer, the voice came again. Evan? This time it sounded farther away. Daniel was staring at me now. Was that you? No. He slowly sat up. Neither of us moved. The rain continued falling. Then a third voice came from somewhere beyond the trees. Daniel's voice. Evan, come here. Daniel looked at me. His face had gone pale. Because he was sitting directly in front of me. And he hadn't spoken. We stayed inside the shelter until sunrise. Neither of us slept. The next morning, we found no footprints. No animal tracks. Nothing. We checked the recording equipment. The microphones had been running all night. There was nothing unusual. Except for one file. At 2:14 a.m., the microphone nearest my tent had recorded 3 seconds of audio. It contained my voice. Daniel? Then Daniel's voice. Yeah? Then my voice again. Don't turn around. We listened to it 5 times. Neither of us remembered saying those words. That was when we stopped joking about the rules. The second night, we moved our campsite closer to the shelter. We told ourselves it was practical. The shelter had walls. A roof. A door. But there was another reason. Neither of us wanted to sleep in the open forest anymore. The weather cleared. The stars came out. And somehow that made everything worse. The Appalachian night can be unbelievably dark. People who have only experienced darkness near towns don't understand it. There is a difference between darkness and the absence of artificial light. In the city, darkness still has a horizon. You can see distant streetlights, windows, headlights, the glow of civilization. In the mountains, there are places where the night feels physical, like something occupying space. You look between 2 trees and see nothing. Not blackness. Nothing. Your eyes keep trying to create shapes inside it. A person. An animal. A face. Anything. That's how fear works. Your brain hates incomplete information. It would rather invent a monster than accept uncertainty. At around 11:30, Daniel and I were sitting inside the shelter when we heard a branch snap outside. We both looked at the door. Another snap. Closer. Then another. Daniel whispered, Rule 2. I nodded. We stopped moving. The footsteps began. Slow. Heavy. They approached the shelter. 1 step. Pause. Another. Pause. Another. Then they stopped directly outside the door. Neither of us breathed. A minute passed. Then 2. Nothing. Daniel slowly raised his hand toward the door. I grabbed his wrist. He looked at me. I shook my head. 5 minutes. 10. Still nothing. Then a voice came through the wall. Daniel's voice. Open the door. Daniel's face changed. The voice continued. It's cold out here. Daniel whispered. That's not me. The voice outside laughed. It was a perfect copy of him. Not similar. Perfect. Same laugh. Same breathing. Same little hesitation before speaking. Dan, I whispered. He looked at me. Don't answer it. He nodded. The voice outside became quieter. Evan? I closed my eyes. Evan, are you awake? Silence. Then my own voice answered from outside. Yeah. Daniel looked at me. I hadn't spoken. The thing outside continued. I'm scared. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was frightening. Because it sounded sincere. It sounded like me. Not a monster pretending to be human. Me. The exact version of myself I heard internally when I was afraid. The thing outside began whispering. Please. Then. Please let me in. Daniel covered his ears. I stared at the door. Something inside me wanted to open it. Not because I believed the voice. Because hearing your own voice ask for help creates a strange psychological pressure. Your brain recognizes it as you. And part of you responds before logic has a chance. That was when I understood the real danger of Rule 3. It wasn't about hearing a voice. It was about recognizing yourself inside it. The voice outside whispered again. Evan. I didn't respond. Evan. I stayed silent. Evan. Then it said something I had never told Daniel. Your father used to call you that when you were little. My stomach dropped. My father had been dead for 11 years. Daniel knew that. But he didn't know the nickname my father used. Nobody did. At least, nobody I had told. The voice whispered it. Exactly. A childhood nickname I hadn't heard spoken aloud since I was 12. I started shaking. Daniel noticed. What did it say? I couldn't answer. The voice outside laughed softly. Then it said, You remember. We stayed awake until morning. At sunrise, the voice was gone. The door was still closed. There were footprints outside. Bare feet. Human footprints. They started approximately 30 feet from the shelter. They came directly toward the door. And then stopped. There were no footprints leading away. Daniel photographed them. We decided to leave. Immediately. We packed everything. The weather had changed again. Clouds rolled over the ridge. A heavy fog descended into the valley. We followed the trail we'd used to enter. It should have taken 3 hours to reach the vehicle. After 2 hours, we found the same fallen tree we'd passed earlier. Daniel marked it with orange tape. We continued. 40 minutes later, we found it again. Same tree. Same broken branch. Same patch of pale fungus growing on the trunk. Daniel stared at it. We're walking in circles. I checked the compass. The needle pointed east. The trail ran north. We turned. 20 minutes later, we found the tree again. This time the orange tape was gone. Daniel looked at me. Did you move it? No. Either of us spoke. We turned around. The fog thickened. Then we heard footsteps. Behind us. Rule 2. We stopped. The footsteps stopped. We waited. Nothing. Daniel whispered. It's following us. I whispered back. Don't talk. A minute passed. Then the footsteps began again. We stopped. They stopped. We walked. They walked. We stopped. They stopped. It continued for nearly an hour. Finally, Daniel said something I will never forget. Evan, I think it's learning. I looked at him. What? The timing. He swallowed. Every time we stop, it stops. We waited. The footsteps didn't move. Daniel took one step backward. The footsteps behind us took one step forward. He stepped forward. They stepped forward. He stopped. They stopped. Then Daniel did something stupid. He whispered, Who's there? The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a voice behind us said, Who's there? Daniel closed his eyes. It had copied him again. But this time there was something different. The voice sounded closer. Not behind us. inside the space between us. I turned. I don't know why. Maybe instinct. Maybe fear. Maybe because some part of me had already decided that knowing was better than not knowing. There was nobody there. Only fog. Trees. Wet leaves. And something moving between the trunks. At first I thought it was a person. Then I realized it was me. I was standing approximately 20 yards away. Same jacket. Same backpack. Same beard. Same posture. It was facing me. Daniel screamed. The figure raised one hand. I raised mine without meaning to. It raised its hand too. I lowered mine. It lowered its. Then it smiled. I don't smile like that. Not consciously. But I recognized it. It was the expression I make when I am trying to convince myself I'm not afraid. The figure stepped backward into the fog. And disappeared. We ran. We didn't care about the trail. We didn't care about direction. We just ran. Branches hit our faces. Roots caught our boots. The fog swallowed everything. Daniel was ahead of me. Then I heard him scream. I reached him seconds later. He was standing in the middle of the trail. Staring at something. What? He pointed. There was a clearing ahead. In the center stood an old wooden cabin. I had never seen it before. Daniel whispered. That wasn't there. I believed him. Because the cabin looked old. Older than the shelter. Its roof sagged. Its windows were black. The door was open. And hanging above the doorway was a wooden sign. 3 words had been carved into it. You have been here. Daniel looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us moved. Then something inside the cabin called my name. My own voice. Evan. I felt something in my chest collapse. Because this time, the voice wasn't asking me to come closer. It was crying. Evan, please. Daniel grabbed my arm. Don't. The voice sobbed. Please. Then it said. I don't want to be alone. That sentence broke something inside me. Because I understood it. The forest wasn't pretending to be me. It was taking the parts of me that were easiest to imitate. My memories. My fears. My loneliness. My need to be heard. The cabin was using my own emotions as bait. And suddenly I realized something worse. It wasn't trying to get me inside. It was trying to make me answer. Rule 3 never said the voice would hurt you. It only said never answer. That meant answering was the dangerous part. Not the voice. Not the forest. The response. Because if the thing could make you answer yourself, then maybe it didn't need to imitate you anymore. Maybe it could become you. Daniel pulled me away. We walked backward. The cabin remained in the clearing. The door slowly closed. Then the forest became silent. Completely silent. Daniel whispered. We're leaving. We started walking. This time, we didn't run. We followed the compass. We followed the terrain. We ignored every voice. We ignored footsteps. We ignored whispers. At one point, I heard my mother calling my name. She had been dead for 6 years. At another point, I heard my father's voice. Then Daniel heard his own. We kept walking. Eventually, the fog lifted. We found the access road. Our truck was there. Neither of us remembered reaching it. We drove for almost 4 hours without speaking. At a gas station outside the mountains, Daniel finally stopped. He got out. He walked around the truck. Then he looked at me through the driver's window. Evan. I looked at him. He said, Did you hear that? I turned off the engine. What? He stared at the forest behind the gas station. Nothing. I laughed. It was the first time either of us had laughed in days. We went home. The project was cancelled. No explanation was given. The equipment was collected. The recordings were archived. I never returned to Blackridge. For a long time, I convinced myself it had been some combination of exhaustion, stress, environmental disorientation, and fear. That's the explanation I wanted. And maybe it was true. Maybe the human brain can create astonishing things when it is frightened enough. Maybe Daniel and I experienced nothing supernatural at all. Maybe we simply became trapped in a dangerous wilderness environment, and our minds filled in the gaps. I lived with that explanation for nearly 3 years. Then I found the paper. The 3 rules. I had kept it. I don't remember taking it. I found it inside an old field notebook while cleaning my apartment. The paper was folded 4 times. The ink was faded. I unfolded it. Rule 1. Never follow lights that appear between the trees. Rule 2. If you hear footsteps behind you, stop walking until they stop. Rule 3. Never answer your own voice after dark. I stared at it for a long time. Then I noticed something I'd never seen before. There was writing on the back. 1 sentence. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it. Maybe I had never turned the paper over. Maybe the words hadn't been there before. The sentence said, "The rules are not to protect you from it." I stopped breathing. There was another line underneath. "They are to protect it from you." I read it again. And again. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But I did. There was silence. I said hello? Nothing. Then I heard breathing. My breathing. Slow. Uneven. Exactly the way I breathe when I'm frightened. I hung up. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. It rang a 3rd time. Then stopped. A message appeared. 1 sentence. You should have answered yourself. I never slept properly after that. I changed my phone number. Moved apartments. Stopped working in remote areas. I started sleeping with music playing because silence made me uncomfortable. And whenever I heard my name spoken from another room, I waited. I never answered immediately. I always made sure there was another person there. I thought that was enough. Until last winter. I was alone in my apartment. It was around 2 in the morning. Snow had covered the windows. The heating system had stopped working. I was sitting on the couch with a blanket around me when I heard something from the hallway. "Evan." I froze. I knew that voice. Mine. It came from the darkness beyond the living room. "Evan." I didn't answer. The voice laughed softly. Then it said, "Rule 3. I closed my eyes. The voice continued. "You still remember?" I stayed silent. Then it whispered, "We're getting better." I opened my eyes. There was a figure standing at the end of the hallway. I couldn't see its face. But I knew exactly who it was. Me. It stood there wearing the same clothes I was wearing. It tilted its head. I did not move. It smiled. Then it said, "Do you know why you never saw us leave the forest?" I didn't answer. The figure stepped closer. "Because we didn't." Another step. "We came home with you." I couldn't breathe. The hallway light flickered. The figure was suddenly gone. I stayed on the couch until sunrise. When morning came, there was nothing in the hallway. No footprints. No figure. Nothing. I eventually convinced myself it had been a hallucination. A nightmare while awake. Stress. Sleep deprivation. Anything but the alternative. But there is one thing I can't explain. When I went to make coffee that morning, I found a wet boot print on the kitchen floor. Barely visible. Human. Facing the front door. And beside it was another print. Smaller. As if someone had been standing there barefoot for a very long time. I don't live near the Appalachian Mountains anymore. I don't work outdoors. I don't sleep near open windows. I don't go camping. And I never answer when I hear my own voice. Not after dark. Not during the day. Not even as a joke. Because I finally understand what Rule 3 was trying to teach. The forest doesn't need to chase you. It doesn't need claws. It doesn't need teeth. It doesn't even need to leave the trees. It only needs you to recognize something familiar in the darkness. Your own voice. Your own memories. Your own loneliness. And when you hear yourself calling from somewhere you know you aren't standing, the most dangerous instinct you have is the desire to answer. Because answering means accepting that the voice belongs to you. And if something in the darkness can convince you that it is you, you may never know which one of you walked out of the forest. Sometimes I still hear it. Usually late at night. A voice from the hallway. A whisper through the wall. A quiet call from somewhere behind me. Evan. I never turn around. I never answer. I just sit there in the darkness and listen. Because every once in a while, after the voice calls my name, I hear something else. Footsteps. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. And the worst part is this. I don't know whether the footsteps are getting closer, or whether they're coming from inside my own apartment. I used to think the greatest danger in the wilderness was getting lost. Now I know that's not true. Getting lost only means you don't know where you are. The real danger is discovering that something else knows exactly where you are, and sounds exactly like you. The forest doesn't always reveal monsters. Sometimes it reveals the parts of ourselves we spend our entire lives trying not to hear. And sometimes, when the darkness calls your name, the safest thing you can do is remain silent. Because the voice waiting for your answer may already know exactly what you're going to say. For 3 weeks after that night, nothing happened. That was almost worse. I started to believe the voice had finally stopped. I went to work. I bought groceries. I answered emails. I sat in coffee shops surrounded by strangers and reminded myself that I was living in the real world. The normal world. The world where voices came from people. Where footsteps belonged to someone walking. Where forests stayed in forests. I needed those rules. Because once you lose your trust in ordinary things, everything becomes suspicious. A knock on the door isn't a knock anymore. It's a question. A voice calling your name isn't a voice. It's an invitation. And silence isn't peaceful. It's waiting. I thought I was getting better. Then I received an envelope. There was no stamp. No return address. My name was handwritten across the front. Evan Mercer. The handwriting looked familiar. Not because I recognized the person who wrote it. Because I recognized the pressure. The way the letters leaned slightly forward. The way the E in Evan was drawn with a longer middle line. It looked like my handwriting. I stood in my apartment holding that envelope for almost 5 minutes. I considered throwing it away. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. Black and white. Old. A forest. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. Then I recognized the ridge. The trees. The narrow valley. The same valley where Daniel and I had found the shelter. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "You left something behind." Underneath that was a date. August 17th. 3 years earlier. The exact date we entered Blackridge. I stared at the photograph until my hands began shaking. There was something else in the picture. A person. Standing between the trees. Too far away to identify. But I knew who it was. Me. The photograph had been taken from behind. I was wearing the same jacket. The same backpack. The same boots. The problem was that the picture had been taken from an angle where nobody could have been standing. I remembered that moment. I remembered walking along that trail. I remembered Daniel being approximately 30 yards ahead of me. I remembered turning around because I thought I heard something. But I didn't remember anyone taking a photograph. I flipped it over again. There was another sentence beneath the date. You were not the first. I didn't sleep that night. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside my apartment. I lived on the 4th floor. There was no reason for footsteps to be outside my door. But there they were. Slow. Bare. Wet. 1, 2, 3. They stopped. I sat on my bed staring at the doorway. Then came 3 knocks. I didn't move. Another 3 knocks. Then my own voice said, "Evan." I covered my mouth. The voice continued, "Open the door." I stayed silent. The doorknob moved. Once. Twice. Then stopped. I expected something to break through. It didn't. Instead, the voice whispered, "That's better." Then the footsteps walked away. I waited 20 minutes before I moved. When I finally reached the door, I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door. Nothing. But there were wet footprints on the carpet. They led from my apartment door toward the stairwell. I followed them with my eyes. There were 6 footprints. Then nothing. No footprints coming back. I closed the door. That morning I called Daniel. The number was disconnected. I called his old workplace. He no longer worked there. I searched online. Nothing. No social media. No professional profile. No public record that I could find. It was as if Daniel had disappeared. I told myself that wasn't possible. People change numbers. People move. People delete accounts. People leave jobs. But I knew Daniel. He was the kind of person who complained about changing passwords. The kind of person who used the same email address for everything. I spent the entire morning searching. Eventually, I found something. A property record. A house in western North Carolina. The name was Daniel Voss. Same age. Same middle initial. Same birth year. I drove there that afternoon. The house was empty. Not abandoned. Empty. There were curtains. Furniture. A car in the driveway. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter. But nobody inside. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Then I heard something from the backyard. A voice. "Evan?" I froze. It was Daniel. I hadn't heard his voice in 3 years. I walked around the house. He was standing near a wooden shed. Older. Thinner. His beard had grown out. He looked exhausted. But it was him. I almost hugged him. Then I noticed his expression. He wasn't happy to see me. He looked terrified. "Why are you here?" he asked. "I thought you disappeared." His eyes moved toward the forest behind the house. "You should not have come." I told him about the envelope. The photograph. The footprints. The voice. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he stared at me for several seconds. Then he said, "It found you again." I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked into the shed and returned carrying a cardboard box. He placed it on the ground between us. Inside were notebooks. Dozens of them. Some were old. Some looked recent. I picked one up. The cover had a date written on it. 1986. I opened it. The handwriting was different. But the first sentence made my stomach tighten. I heard my own voice tonight. I looked at Daniel. "What is this?" He sat down. "Before we went into Blackridge, I thought the rules were folklore." "So did I." "No." He shook his head. "You thought they were folklore." I stared at him. "What did you think?" He looked toward the trees. "I thought they were instructions." "For what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another notebook. The pages were filled with descriptions. Names. Dates. Locations. Voices. Disappearances. Some entries went back decades. Some went back more than a century. The earliest one was dated 1912. A man named Thomas Weller had written about a logging camp in the mountains. 3 workers disappeared. The surviving workers reported hearing their names spoken from the forest at night. The voices belonged to people who were already dead. One worker answered. He disappeared the following morning. The other 2 refused to speak about what happened. The final entry said, "We have learned that the forest does not imitate the dead. It imitates the living." I looked at Daniel. "Who wrote these?" "People who heard it." "How many?" He looked at the box. "Enough." I turned another page. A woman's name. 1947. She described hearing her own voice outside her cabin. She didn't answer. For 11 nights, the voice returned. On the 12th night, it stopped. She believed it was gone. Then she heard her voice from inside the cabin. She was alone. The entry ended there. I turned another page. 1973. A hunter heard himself calling from across a valley. He answered. His hunting partner watched him walk into the trees. The hunter came back 20 minutes later. He looked normal. He spoke normally. He knew everything. Except one thing. He couldn't remember his own name. I closed the notebook. "What is this?" Daniel said. "We don't know. There has to be an explanation." "There probably is." "What?" He looked at me. "That's the problem." I waited. He continued. "Everyone who studies it starts with the assumption that there is something in the forest. And eventually they realize they're asking the wrong question." I felt a cold pressure in my chest. "What question should they be asking?" Daniel looked directly at me. "Why does it need us to answer?" Either of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees. For the first time since arriving at his house, I noticed something strange. There were no birds. No insects. Nothing. The forest behind his property was completely silent. Daniel saw me looking. "You hear it?" "Hear what?" He leaned closer. "Exactly." We spent the next several hours going through his notebooks. He explained that after Blackridge, he had started researching the phenomenon. Not because he wanted to. Because he couldn't stop thinking about it. He found references in old journals. Local folklore. Personal diaries. Handwritten field notes. Stories that had never been published. Most of them described the same basic pattern. A person enters a remote forest. They hear an unexplained voice. Eventually, the voice becomes familiar. Then personal. Then intimate. It uses memories. Secrets. Regrets. Things the person has never told anyone. And finally, it uses their own voice. That was always the last stage. Daniel called it the echo. I asked why. Because calling it a creature gives us the wrong idea. "What is it then?" He shook his head. "We don't know." "Then why call it anything?" "Because humans need names for things they don't understand." I remembered the figure in the fog. The one that looked like me. I asked him about it. Daniel went completely still. "You saw one?" "Yes." He stared at me. "You shouldn't have." "What does that mean?" He closed his eyes. "The voices are one thing. And the figures?" He looked toward the forest. "They come later." "How much later?" He didn't answer. I repeated the question. Finally he said, "Usually after you've answered." I felt sick. I never answered. Daniel looked at me. "Yes, you did." "No. You said something." "When?" "In the forest." I remembered. The cabin. The voice crying. The thing calling my name. I hadn't answered it. I was certain. Then Daniel said, "You whispered I'm here." I stared at him. He was right. I remembered saying it. Barely. Almost involuntarily. The voice had sounded like me. It had sounded frightened. And I had whispered, "I'm here." 3 words. That was all. I felt my mouth go dry. Daniel stood. "We have to go." "Where?" "Blackridge." I laughed. It wasn't funny. "No. We need to finish it." "We already left." "No." He picked up the photograph. "We left physically." He turned it over. "You saw this?" I nodded. He pointed to the figure in the trees. "Look at the position." I did. The figure was standing approximately 30 yards behind the photographer. Daniel continued. "That picture wasn't taken when we were leaving." "Then when?" He turned the photograph over. The date was still visible. August 17th. But underneath it, almost invisible, was another number. 3:17. I looked at him. "That's the time." "Yes." The time the voice appeared in my apartment. 3 years after the photograph was supposedly taken. My stomach tightened. Daniel said, "Whatever this is, it doesn't experience time the way we do." I didn't want to believe him. But I remembered the cabin, the impossible tree, the missing footprints, the figure wearing my clothes. I asked him what happened after I left Blackridge. He hesitated. Then he said, "I went back." I stared at him. "Why?" "Because I thought you were still there." I felt my heart stop. "What?" "The night we left." He sat down. "I woke up at the truck." "You were driving?" "No." He shook his head. "I wasn't." The room seemed to become colder. "You were?" "No." He looked directly at me. "I woke up in the passenger seat." I couldn't speak. "I thought you were driving," he continued. "But when I looked over, you weren't there." My hands went numb. "What did you do?" "I stopped the truck." "And?" "I waited." "For how long?" "Almost an hour." "Then what?" "I heard footsteps." Daniel's face had gone pale. "They came from behind the truck." He swallowed. "Then I heard your voice." "What did it say?" He looked at the floor. "It said, 'Don't leave me.'" I closed my eyes. Daniel continued. "I got out." "Why?" "I thought you were outside." "You knew the rules." "I know." He shook his head. "But I was scared." He looked at me. "That is what it wants." "What?" "Not obedience." His voice dropped. "Emotion." He opened another notebook. There was a sentence written across the page. "Fear opens the door." I read it twice. Then Daniel said, "When I got out of the truck, I saw you." I stared at him. "Where?" "About 50 yards down the road." "What were you doing?" "Standing." "Looking at you?" "No." He paused. "You were looking at the forest." My skin prickled. "And then?" "You turned around." Daniel's eyes met mine. "And you smiled." I couldn't breathe. "What happened next?" "You said my name." He looked down. Then I answered. Silence. I whispered. "You answered." He nodded. "That was the mistake." "What happened?" Daniel closed the notebook. "I don't remember." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I remember answering." "Then what?" "Nothing." "Daniel." He looked at me. "That is what I lost." "What?" "My memory." He tapped his head. "Not all of it." He looked toward the window. "Just the parts that happened after I answered." I didn't know what to say. He stood and walked toward the kitchen. I followed. He opened a drawer. Inside was a photograph. An old family picture. Daniel as a child. His mother. His father. His younger sister. He pointed to the girl. "That's my sister." I looked at him. "You have a sister?" "No." I frowned. "She died when I was 7. He touched the photograph. "I remember her." His voice cracked. "But I don't remember how she died." I stared at him. "Why?" He looked at me. "Because that's what it took." I didn't understand. He explained. "When I answered the voice, it took something from me." "What?" "I don't know." "Your sister?" "Maybe." He turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. A child's handwriting. Daniel plus Emily. I felt a chill. "Who is Emily?" He smiled sadly. "My sister." Then he looked at me. "And that's the problem." "What?" "I don't know if she was ever real." The room seemed to tilt. Daniel continued. "Every time I remember something about her, another memory disappears." I stepped back. "What?" "That's why I stopped remembering." He pointed to the notebooks. "I write everything down." He tapped his chest. "Because I'm afraid I'll forget who I am." We stood in silence. Then something knocked on the back door. 3 times. Knock. 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 Daniel looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us moved. The knock came again. 3 times. Then a voice said, "Daniel?" His face went white. I knew that voice. It wasn't mine. It wasn't his. It was a woman's. Young. Soft. Afraid. Daniel whispered, "Emily." The voice came again. "Danny?" He covered his mouth. I grabbed his shoulder. "Don't." The voice outside laughed. Not cruelly. Sadly. "Danny, it's me." Daniel began crying. I had never seen him cry before. The voice continued, "I've been waiting." He shook his head. "No. Please. No. I know you remember me." Daniel closed his eyes. The voice whispered, "You promised you wouldn't forget." Daniel took 1 step toward the door. I grabbed him. He turned. "She knows my nickname. It's using your memories. She knows things. So did the thing in the forest. She knows about Emily. Daniel. She knows." I held him tighter. "That's exactly why you can't answer." The voice outside went silent. Then it said something that stopped both of us. "Evan." Daniel looked at me. The voice continued, "You remember her too?" I froze. I had never heard the name Emily before that moment. At least I thought I hadn't. Then something happened inside my mind. A memory. Not mine. A little girl standing beside a creek. Brown hair. Red sweater. Mud on her knees. She was laughing. A boy stood beside her. Daniel. I could see them. I could smell the water. Hear the insects. Feel the warm afternoon sun. And I knew the boy was 7 years old. I knew the girl's name. Emily. I knew she was Daniel's sister. I knew she had died. And I knew exactly where. My stomach turned. Because none of those memories belonged to me. I had never met her. Yet I remembered her. Every detail. Daniel stared at me. "You see her?" I couldn't answer. He whispered, "Don't." The voice outside laughed. Then the back door began to open. Slowly. The handle turned. The latch clicked. Daniel grabbed my arm. "Run!" We didn't go toward the front door. We ran upstairs. Behind us, the back door opened. A cold wind swept through the house. Then came footsteps. Bare feet. Wet. Coming up the stairs. 1, 2, 3. Daniel slammed the bedroom door. We pushed a dresser against it. The footsteps stopped outside. Silence. Then Emily's voice whispered, "Danny?" Daniel covered his ears. The voice became softer. "You promised." He started shaking. I looked around the room. There was a window. 4 floors above ground. No other exit. The footsteps moved closer. They stopped directly outside the bedroom. Then my voice spoke. "Evan." I looked at Daniel. He looked at me. My voice said, "I'm here." I didn't respond. The voice laughed. Then it whispered, "Good." The bedroom door handle moved. The dresser shook. Daniel grabbed my wrist. "Window." We climbed out. The roof was covered in rain. We moved along the narrow ledge toward the garage. Behind us, the bedroom door opened. I didn't look. I heard my own voice calling. Then Daniel's. Then Emily's. Then mine again. 3 voices. All calling us home. We dropped onto the garage roof. Then onto the ground. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the road. Daniel bent over, trying to breathe. I looked back at the house. Every window was dark. Then one upstairs window lit up. A silhouette stood behind the glass. It looked like me. It raised its hand. I didn't wave. We drove away. Neither of us spoke. After 20 minutes, Daniel finally said, "We can't go back." I said, "I know." "No." He looked at me. "You don't understand." "What?" "We're already back." I looked at the road. What do you mean? He pointed ahead. My headlights illuminated a wooden sign. Blackridge Access Road. I slammed the brakes. The truck stopped. Neither of us moved. We were nowhere near Blackridge. We had been driving east. The road should have taken us toward the interstate. Instead, we were looking at the same mountain. The same trees. The same fog. The same darkness. And on the roadside was the old shelter. The one we had found 3 years ago. Its door was open. A light burned inside. Daniel whispered. Rule 1. I stared at the light. Never follow lights that appear between the trees. The light flickered. Then a second light appeared farther down the road. Then a third. They weren't flashlights. They were windows. 3 glowing windows deep inside the forest. Daniel whispered. They want us to choose. I looked at the 3 lights. For the first time, I understood something. The rules weren't instructions for surviving the forest. They were instructions for navigating it. And every rule had a purpose. Rule 1 stopped us from following something. Rule 2 stopped us from responding to something. Rule 3 stopped us from becoming something. I looked at Daniel. Where does the 4th rule go? He didn't answer. I looked at the notebooks. He had never mentioned a 4th rule. Then something moved in the darkness beside the road. A figure stepped into the headlights. It was wearing my jacket. It had my face. But this time, it wasn't smiling. It was crying. It raised one hand. And pointed behind me. I turned. Daniel was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The door was still closed. His backpack remained on the floor. His notebook was open. I picked it up. The final page contained a sentence I had never seen before. It was written in my handwriting. Not Daniel's. Mine. It said. If you see yourself crying, don't comfort it. I looked toward the figure again. It was still standing in the road. Still crying. Still pointing behind me. And then I realized what it was pointing at. The back seat. Someone was sitting there. I could see the outline. A person. Motionless. Waiting. Then my own voice whispered directly beside my ear. Evan. I didn't move. Don't look. The voice posed. Then. It's not me. I stared straight ahead. The figure in front of the truck slowly stopped crying. It smiled. And from the back seat, something whispered. That's what I told him. The truck engine died. The headlights went out. And for the first time in my life, I understood what true darkness felt like. Not the absence of light. The absence of certainty. Because in that darkness, I could hear 3 people breathing. Mine. Daniel's. And something else. Something breathing exactly the way I'd breathed. And somewhere beyond the windshield, in the forest we had supposedly left 3 years ago, a 4th voice began calling my name. The 4th voice called my name again. Evan. I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. The truck was completely dark. The engine had died. The headlights were gone. Outside, the forest had disappeared into a wall of blackness. But I could hear breathing. 3 different rhythms. Mine. The thing behind me. And something outside the truck. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. I could feel the leather beneath my fingers. That mattered. I needed something physical. Something real. Something that belonged to me. The voice behind me whispered again. Evan. I stared through the windshield. Nothing. Then I heard Daniel. Evan, don't turn around. His voice came from the back seat. I almost cried with relief. Daniel? The instant I said his name, he screamed. Not a normal scream. It was the sound of someone being hurt. Then everything went silent. I closed my eyes. I had answered. Not myself. But I had answered. And somewhere inside the darkness, something laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't even threatening. It sounded relieved. Like someone who had finally received the response they were waiting for. I started the truck. The engine turned over immediately. The headlights came back. The back seat was empty. Daniel was gone. I looked at the passenger seat. His backpack was still there. His notebook was still open. I grabbed it. The page had changed. The sentence I had read before was gone. In its place was another line. You answered. I threw the notebook onto the passenger seat. Then I drove. I didn't care where the road went. I didn't care whether I was heading toward the highway or deeper into the mountains. I only wanted distance. The road twisted through the trees. The fog lifted. The sky began turning gray. Eventually I saw a gas station. A real one. Bright lights. Parking lot. 2 pickup trucks. A man standing outside drinking coffee. Civilization. I pulled in. I parked beneath the brightest light I could find. Then I sat there with both hands on the wheel. The man with the coffee looked at me. I must have looked insane. Wet clothes. Blood on my sleeve from a branch. Mud on my boots. Eyes that hadn't slept. He approached the truck. You okay? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. He looked toward the back seat. Someone with you? I looked at him. What? You were talking. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't. He frowned. You were. I looked through the rearview mirror. Empty. The man stepped closer. You sure you're all right? I nodded. He studied me. Then he said something that made every hair on my arm stand up. You should probably get that other guy out of the woods. I stared at him. What other guy? He pointed toward the forest across the road. There was a man standing out there. My mouth went dry. When? Just before you pulled in. What did he look like? The man shrugged. Couldn't see his face. Was he wearing a yellow jacket? He looked at me. Yes. I looked down. I was wearing a yellow field jacket. He walked away. I sat there for another minute. Then I saw the reflection in the gas station window. A man was standing behind me. Yellow jacket. Wet hair. Head lowered. I turned. Nobody. I looked back at the reflection. Still there. Then it raised its head. It was me. I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached a motel several miles outside town. The room smelled like bleach and old carpet. I locked the door. Then I pushed the dresser against it. I checked the bathroom. Closet. Under the bed. Behind the curtains. Nothing. I sat on the edge of the mattress. My hands were shaking. I opened Daniel's notebook. I don't know why. Maybe because I had nothing else. Maybe because I needed an explanation. The first pages were filled with observations. Dates. Names. Locations. Then I found a section titled, The First Rule. Underneath it, Daniel had written, The lights are not lights. They are memories. I read the sentence again. The lights are memories. He explained that every person who encountered them described something different. A lantern. A cabin window. A flashlight. A campfire. A porch light. But nobody ever reported seeing the same light twice. The common element was not the appearance. It was familiarity. The light always looked like somewhere the person wanted to go. Home. A campsite. A childhood house. A friend's cabin. Somewhere safe. The forest didn't create fear first. It created comfort. That was why Rule 1 existed. Never follow lights that appear between the trees. Because the light wasn't leading you somewhere. It was leading you into a memory. I turned the page. The second rule. If you hear footsteps behind you, stop walking until they stop. Daniel had written. The footsteps are not following you. They are measuring you. Every time you walk, they learn your rhythm. Every time you stop, they learn your fear. The footsteps don't need to catch you. They only need to know how you move. I turned the page. The third rule. Never answer your own voice after dark. Underneath it was a paragraph. The voice is not an imitation. That is the mistake people make. It isn't copying you. It is remembering you. I stopped reading. My heartbeat increased. Remembering me. The phrase made something click. The voice knew my father's nickname. It knew Daniel's sister. It knew things neither of us had consciously shared. It wasn't listening to our conversations. It was accessing memories. But from where? I turned the page. The next paragraph had been crossed out. I could still make out some of the words. Memory is not stored only in the brain. I stared at the sentence. Then another line beneath it. A place can remember. I closed the notebook. That idea was ridiculous. A place cannot remember. A mountain doesn't remember. A forest doesn't remember. Trees don't store human memories. But then I remembered the cabin. The photograph. The figure. The voices. And the memory of Emily. A memory that did not belong to me. I opened the notebook again. The next page contained a name. Thomas Weller. The 1912 logger. Daniel had traced his story. Thomas wasn't simply one of the first people to encounter the phenomenon. He was one of the first people to document the rules. His journal described a place called Hollow Creek. According to the journal, 7 men had been working in the mountains. One disappeared. Then another. Then a third. The survivors believed the missing men had been attacked by animals. Until one night they heard them calling from the forest. The voices were perfect. But the men who disappeared had been dead for days. Thomas wrote that the voices knew personal things. Names. Childhood memories. Private conversations. Then one of the surviving workers answered. The next morning, his companions found him standing at the edge of camp. Alive. Uninjured. But he couldn't remember who he was. Thomas wrote. He knows our names. He knows our faces. But when he looks at himself, he asks who the stranger is. I felt cold. That sounded exactly like the hunter from 1973. And exactly like Daniel. I kept reading. Thomas believed the forest wasn't taking people's bodies. It was taking their identity. Not all at once. Piece by piece. A memory here. A name there. A face. A voice. A relationship. Until the person became an empty space that something else could inhabit. I whispered. No. The motel room remained silent. Then someone whispered from the bathroom. Yes. I froze. I slowly looked toward the bathroom door. It was closed. I hadn't locked it. The voice came again. Yes. My voice. I stood. The bathroom door opened by itself. Darkness. Nothing else. I backed away. Then the light flickered on. The mirror was fogged. Someone had written a word across it. Emily. I stopped breathing. I didn't know Emily. Not really. But when I looked at the name, another memory entered my mind. A little girl standing beside a creek. This time, I saw her face clearly. She was smiling. And beside her stood Daniel. But there was someone else. A third child. A boy. Me. I stumbled backward. The memory vanished. I stared at the mirror. The word Emily slowly disappeared as the condensation cleared. Then another word appeared. 3. I didn't understand. 3 what? 3 people? 3 rules? 3 memories? Then I heard a knock. Not from the door. From inside the wall. 3 knocks. I stepped back. 3 more. Then a voice whispered. Rule 4. I stared at the wall. There was no rule 4. The voice whispered again. You forgot. Something moved behind the wall. A slow scraping sound. Like fingernails dragging across wood. I grabbed the notebook. I flipped through the pages. There were dozens of notes. But no 4th rule. Then I noticed something. Several pages had been torn out. Not ripped randomly. Carefully removed. The edges were clean. Someone had taken them. I looked at the notebook cover. There was an indentation where something had once been attached. A small metal clip. I remembered Daniel carrying a second notebook. A black one. He had never shown it to me. I searched his backpack. Nothing. Then I remembered his house. The shed. The cardboard box. There had been another notebook underneath everything. Black cover. Red string around it. I hadn't noticed it then. I needed to go back. The thought terrified me. But there was something worse. I couldn't remember whether Daniel had left the motel with me. I looked at the passenger seat. His backpack was there. The notebook was there. But I couldn't remember putting either one in the truck. I checked my phone. There was a message. From Daniel. It had been sent 12 minutes earlier. It said, "Do not come back for me." I stared at it. Then another message arrived. "You already did." I dropped the phone. Outside the motel room, someone began walking. Slowly. One foot. Then another. The footsteps stopped outside my door. A voice whispered, "Evan." I didn't answer. The voice changed. "Daniel." "Evan, it's me." I stayed silent. Then Emily. "Danny?" Silence. Then my father. "Son?" My chest tightened. I closed my eyes. The voice changed again. "My mother." "Evan?" I almost answered. That was the closest I came. Not because I believed it was my mother. Because for 1 second, I wanted it to be. That was the real danger. Not fear. Hope. The voice knew exactly what to use. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was offering me something. One more conversation. One more chance. One more moment with someone I had lost. My eyes filled with tears. The voice whispered, "You can open the door." I didn't. "You can see her again." I didn't move. "You can remember everything." My hand reached for the doorknob. I stopped. Because I finally understood. The forest didn't create memories. It used memories we already wanted to recover. It didn't force people into the darkness. It gave them a reason to walk into it. I stepped away from the door. The voice outside became angry. Not loud. Just disappointed. "You're learning," I whispered. "What are you?" Silence. I realized what I'd done. I had spoken. Not to my own voice. But to whatever was outside. The hallway became completely silent. Then something laughed. My voice. "You're learning." The motel lights went out. I heard the door unlock. I ran. I didn't think. I grabbed the backpack and jumped through the window. The motel room was on the ground floor. I landed hard. Pain shot through my ankle. I crawled behind the building. Then I ran toward my truck. The parking lot was empty. Every light was off. No cars. No people. No motel. I stopped. There was only forest. Trees surrounded me. Tall black trunks. Wet leaves. Fog. I turned around. The motel was gone. I was standing on the old trail. Blackridge. Again. I looked at the backpack. Daniel's notebook was still inside. The pages were blank. Every single page. I flipped through them faster. Blank. 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 Then I reached the final page. There was one sentence. "You have been here before." I laughed. I couldn't help it. A broken, exhausted laugh. "Of course." The forest didn't answer. I looked up. The trail stretched ahead. I recognized it. The same trail from 3 years ago. The same fallen tree. The same ridge. The same bend. But something was different. There were footprints in the mud. 2 sets. One belonged to me. The other belonged to someone walking beside me. I followed them. Not because I wanted to. Because they were fresh. The footprints led to the shelter. The door was open. Inside, a fire burned. Someone was sitting at the wooden table. I couldn't see the face. But I knew the jacket. Yellow. My jacket. The figure looked up. Evan. I stopped. The figure smiled. It was me. But older. Much older. Gray hair. Deep lines around the eyes. A scar across the forehead. It looked exhausted. It looked terrified. And it looked relieved to see me. Finally, it whispered. I couldn't move. The older version of me stood. You don't have much time? I asked. What are you? It smiled sadly. I'm you. No. Yes. You're not me. It walked closer. Not yet. My blood turned cold. What does that mean? The older version of me pointed toward the forest. You think the forest is copying people? He shook his head. That's not what happens. What happens? It replaces them. With what? He looked at me. With the version that would have answered. I couldn't understand. He continued. Every time someone answers their own voice, the forest creates a second version. I thought of the figure in the fog. The copy. No. He shook his head. The original. I stared at him. He continued. You don't understand what you're looking at when you see yourself. He stepped closer. You think you're looking at an imitation. He touched his own chest. You're looking at the version of you that answered. I felt sick. Then who am I? He smiled. That depends. On what? Whether you remember answering. I tried to remember. The forest. The cabin. The voice. I'm here. 3 words. My memory suddenly felt uncertain. Did I say them? Or did something make me remember saying them? The older version of me whispered. That's why the rules exist. I looked at him. What is rule for? He stared at me. For the first time, fear appeared in his eyes. There isn't a 4th rule. Then why did it say there was? Because you asked? I didn't understand. He continued. Every person who reaches this point asks the same question. What question? He looked behind me. I turned. Nothing. Then he whispered. What happens after the 3rd rule? The forest answered. 1,000 voices whispered at once. Mine. Daniel's. Emily's. My father's. My mother's. Voices I didn't recognize. All speaking the same sentence. There is no after. The fire inside the shelter went out. The older version of me disappeared. And I was alone. Except I wasn't. Someone was standing behind me. I could hear breathing. Slow. Steady. Familiar. I didn't turn. The voice whispered. Evan. I closed my eyes. It whispered again. Evan. I stayed silent. Then it said. You already answered. And suddenly I remembered. Not the forest. Not the cabin. Not the truck. Something earlier. Something before all of it. A memory from childhood. A little boy standing beside a creek. A girl in a red sweater. Another boy watching them. Daniel. And me. 3 children. 1 forest. 1 promise. Emily had been crying. Daniel had told her. Don't go into the trees. She had asked why. He said. Because that's where the other Evan lives. I remembered laughing. I remembered thinking it was a game. Then Emily looked at me. She said. What's his name? I answered. I said. Evan. The memory shattered. I dropped to my knees. Because I finally understood. The forest didn't meet us 3 years ago. It met us when we were children. Blackridge wasn't where the story began. It was where the story continued. And Emily hadn't died in an accident. She had disappeared. Because one of us had answered. I looked toward the trees. A little girl stood between them. Red sweater. Mud on her knees. Exactly as I remembered. She smiled. Then she raised one finger to her lips. Shh. Behind her stood Daniel. Then another figure. Me. 3 children. 3 versions. 3 memories. The little girl stepped forward. And finally, I understood what the forest had been waiting for all these years. It wasn't waiting for me to come back. It was waiting for me to remember. Daniel stepped out of the trees. He looked exactly as he had 3 years ago. He smiled. Evan. I didn't answer. He smiled wider. I'm not the one who disappeared. The girl beside him smiled too. Then the other version of me stepped forward. And all 3 of them spoke together. You are. The forest went silent. And somewhere behind me, my own voice whispered the final thing I had spent 3 years refusing to hear. You never escaped. I turned. And saw myself standing there. Not the older version. Not the figure from the road. Me. Exactly as I was. Same age. Same clothes. Same face. Same fear. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us moved. Then he whispered, Which one of us is going home? And that was when the forest began to move.